"You're curious, aren't you?" she said, calm, close, like she already knew the answer. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't just asking a question. She was reading everything I was trying to hide. The afternoon felt ordinary in a way that should have been comforting. Sunlight slipped through the curtains of the living room, laying soft golden lines across the floor. The air carried the faint smell of tea and something freshly cleaned, like the house had been quietly reset before anyone even noticed. I remember sitting there like I always did, relaxed on the couch, phone in hand, pretending to scroll without really seeing anything. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask anything from me, the kind I thought I knew how to exist in. Then she walked in. My friend's mother didn't announce herself. She never needed to. There was a certain rhythm in the way she moved through her home, calm, deliberate, unhurried. She wasn't trying to be noticed, yet somehow she always was. Not because she demanded attention, but because the room seemed to adjust itself around her presence. She paused near the doorway for just a second, her eyes sweeping across the room. When they landed on me, it didn't feel like a casual glance. It felt slightly longer, like she wasn't just seeing me sitting there, but noticing how I was sitting, how still I had become the moment she entered. "Everything okay?" she asked softly, as if it was just a routine question. I nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just scrolling." A small silence followed. Not uncomfortable at first, just brief. But something about the way she didn't immediately move away made it stretch. She walked toward the kitchen counter, but slowly, like she wasn't in a hurry to leave the space I was in. The sound of a glass being placed down echoed lightly. I tried to look back at my phone, but my focus wasn't staying where I wanted it to. Then she spoke again. "You've been coming here a lot lately." It wasn't said like a complaint. It wasn't even said like curiosity. It was more like an observation she had been collecting over time and finally decided to voice. I gave a small laugh, unsure why I suddenly felt the need to explain myself. "We've got exams coming up, and it's quieter here." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, I felt her presence shift. She had turned slightly, facing me more directly now. I didn't look up right away, but I could feel it. The kind of attention that doesn't need sound to exist. And then it came. "You're curious, aren't you?" The words were simple, soft, almost casual in tone, but they landed differently. My fingers paused mid-motion on my phone. For a second, I forgot what I was even doing. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way she said it. Not accusing, not teasing, just certain. Like she already knew something I hadn't admitted to myself yet. I finally looked up. She was standing near the counter, one hand resting lightly on the edge, her posture relaxed but her eyes steady on me. There was no pressure in her expression, no demand for an answer. And somehow, that made it worse, because silence felt like it was answering for me. And in that moment, I couldn't tell anymore if she was talking about something simple or something I wasn't ready to name. After she said it, "You're curious, aren't you?" Nothing obvious changed in the room, but everything inside me shifted. That was the strange part. Life around us continued as if nothing important had happened. The clock still ticked in the background. A distant sound of dishes came from the kitchen. The light still fell the same way across the floor. But my attention didn't belong to any of it anymore. I tried to act normal. I really did. I lowered my gaze back to my phone, scrolling without reading. I even pretended to smile at something I hadn't actually seen. But the effort felt visible even to me, like I was performing a version of myself that didn't quite fit the moment anymore. She didn't repeat the question. She didn't push for an answer. Instead, she simply continued moving around her home with that same quiet ease, the kind of confidence that never feels rushed or uncertain. She poured herself a glass of water, adjusted a small object on the counter, checked something near the shelf. Small actions, nothing unusual. And yet, I noticed everything. The sound of the glass touching the counter felt sharper than before. The soft movement of her footsteps felt more deliberate, even though I knew they weren't. It was as if my senses had tuned themselves to her presence without permission. Once, she walked past the couch where I was sitting. Not too close. Not far either. Just enough that I became painfully aware of the space between us. How it existed, how it narrowed for a second, and how quickly she passed through it like it meant nothing at all. But it didn't feel like nothing to me. For a split second, the air seemed to hold its breath when she was beside me. I didn't move. I didn't look up. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Yet my body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. A slight stillness, a pause in breathing I didn't intend. She stopped near the hallway for a moment, glancing back, not fully turning, just a look over her shoulder. And I felt it immediately, that same awareness again. Like she wasn't just checking the room, but checking me inside it. Her expression stayed calm, neutral, almost gentle. Then she said, casually, "You can stay for dinner if you want. No need to rush." Simple words, ordinary words. But now they didn't feel ordinary anymore, because I couldn't tell if she was just being polite or if she was continuing something I didn't fully understand yet. I nodded too quickly again. "Yes, sure." And she smiled lightly, not wide, not emotional, just a small curve of reassurance. But as she turned away, I realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't the one acting different. It was me, because now I was aware of her even when she wasn't looking at me. And the worst part was I couldn't tell when that awareness had started becoming something deeper than just noticing. By the time the evening settled in, the house had changed its mood again. The bright restlessness of the afternoon faded into something quieter, softer. Lamps were switched on, casting warm pools of light that made the rooms feel smaller, more intimate. Shadows stretched gently along the walls, and everything sounded a little more controlled, like even the silence had learned how to behave. I found myself still there longer than I had planned. That wasn't unusual. I had stayed at my friend's place many times before, but tonight felt different in a way I couldn't easily explain. Not because anything obvious had changed, but because I had. She moved through the kitchen while preparing tea, the soft rhythm of her actions filling the background. The sound of water running, the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic, the gentle opening and closing of a cabinet. All of it felt strangely grounding. Yet my attention kept drifting toward her without permission. She didn't rush. She never did. When she finally placed 2 cups on the small table near me, she sat down across from me instead of leaving the room like I half expected. That alone shifted the atmosphere. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple choice, but it made the space between us feel more defined. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she picked up her cup slowly, her fingers wrapped around it with quiet ease. She took a small sip before looking at me over the rim, her eyes steady but unreadable. "You think too much before you speak," she said gently. There was no judgment in her tone. If anything, it sounded almost like an observation she had been collecting for a while and finally decided to share. I gave a small, awkward smile. "I guess I just don't always know what to say." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied me, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt aware. Like she was noticing patterns, not moments. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't casual anymore either. It had structure now, meaning. She set her cup down carefully. The sound of it touching the table felt louder than it should have. "You're careful," she said after a pause, "even when you don't need to be." I didn't know how to answer that, because it didn't feel like a question. It felt like she was gently turning something in my direction, asking me to recognize it without directly pointing at it. I looked down at my cup instead, watching the faint movement of steam rise. Maybe I just don't like saying the wrong thing. That made her smile, faint but real. Not teasing, not dismissive. Something softer, almost understanding. Or maybe, she said slowly, leaning back slightly in her chair, "You're trying to figure out what people want to hear before you speak." That landed differently. Not harsh, not uncomfortable in a loud way, but precise. like she had lightly touched something I usually kept hidden without even trying. I felt my shoulders tighten slightly, though I didn't move otherwise. She noticed that too. Of course she did. But instead of pressing further, she simply leaned forward again, resting her hands together on the table. Her voice softened. "I'm not judging you," she added quietly. "I'm just listening." And somehow, that was worse than being questioned, because it meant she wasn't guessing anymore. She was starting to understand. Later that evening, the house slipped into a deeper kind of silence. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just settled. The kind of quiet that feels intentional, like the day has finally exhaled. The lights were softer now, reflecting gently off wooden surfaces, and the outside world felt distant, almost irrelevant. I don't remember exactly how we ended up alone in the living room again. It wasn't planned. It never felt planned with her. It was always like moments simply formed around her presence, and I just happened to be inside them. She returned with a second round of tea, placing the cups down with the same calm precision as before. This time, instead of sitting across from me, she chose the adjacent couch. Not directly beside me at first, but close enough that the space between us suddenly mattered more than it should have. I kept my posture still, pretending to focus on the cup in my hands. But I could feel her presence beside me like a quiet shift in temperature, subtle but undeniable. The conversation continued in a slow rhythm. Nothing important on the surface. Small topics. Everyday words. Yet every pause between sentences felt longer than necessary, like the silence itself was participating. At one point, she turned slightly toward me while speaking. Not fully, just enough that her shoulder angled closer in my direction. A soft strand of hair slipped forward near her cheek, and she didn't immediately push it back. I noticed, and I realized, with an uncomfortable clarity, that she noticed I noticed. Neither of us commented on it. Instead, the silence expanded for a moment. Not empty, but charged with something unspoken. Something neither of us was rushing to define. She set her cup down on the small table between us, then leaned back slightly into the couch. Her posture remained composed, but less formal now. More human. "You're quieter tonight," she said gently. It wasn't a question, just another observation. I exhaled lightly, searching for something neutral to say. "Just tired, I guess." She gave a faint nod, but her eyes didn't leave my face immediately. There was a pause, small but noticeable, like she was deciding whether to say something else. Then she did. "You still didn't answer me earlier." The words weren't sharp. They weren't demanding, but they carried weight because of how softly they were delivered. I knew exactly what she meant. The question from earlier still lingered between us, unclaimed and unresolved. I shifted slightly in my seat, suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. Not touching, not even leaning in fully, but close enough that movement felt meaningful now. I didn't know how. I admitted quietly that honesty changed something in the air. She looked at me more directly this time, not analyzing, not testing, just seeing. There was a softness in her expression now that hadn't been there before. Something almost vulnerable, quickly controlled, but not entirely hidden. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she leaned forward just slightly, not crossing the space between us, but narrowing it in a way that made everything feel closer. "I don't ask things without reason," she said quietly. Her voice lowered a fraction. Calm, steady, but more personal now. The space between us felt different after that. Not tense in a fearful way, but alive in a quiet, uncertain way. Like we were both standing at the edge of something neither of us had named yet. And for the first time, I stopped wondering what she was trying to find in me, and started wondering what she might already see. The night felt deeper now, like the house had slowly folded into itself. The earlier warmth of conversation had faded into something quieter, heavier. Even the light seemed softer, dimmer, as if it was trying not to interrupt what was happening between us. We were still sitting in the same space, but something in the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't obvious at first. No silencift, no dramatic moment. Just a gradual tightening of silence. Like the air itself had become more aware. She didn't speak for a while. Neither did I. But this silence wasn't the same as before. Earlier, silence felt like observation, like she was studying me without pressure. Now it felt like something was waiting to be said, something that could no longer stay hidden comfortably. I remember shifting slightly on the couch, my hands resting loosely together, trying to appear relaxed even though I wasn't. She finally looked at me more directly. Not casually this time, not observationally, fully. Her gaze held steady, and for the first time, I didn't feel like she was analyzing me. I felt like she was waiting for honesty. "You're still holding back," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was gentler than that. Almost like she was speaking about something fragile she didn't want to break. I let out a small breath when I didn't realize I'd been holding. My eyes dropped briefly before returning to her. "I don't know what you want me to say," I admitted. That was the truth, or at least part of it. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap. But her expression changed, just subtly. Something softened in her eyes, like she had been expecting this exact answer all along. Then she spoke again, quieter. "I don't want you to say anything I want to hear." The words landed differently than everything before, because they weren't guiding me anymore. They were freeing me. The silence that followed felt heavier, but not uncomfortable. It felt honest. I looked at her properly then. Really looked. The way she sat there, composed, calm, but not distant anymore. There was something human in her now. Something less controlled than before. A small vulnerability that she didn't hide quickly enough. And I realized something unsettling. She wasn't unaffected either. That realization made my chest tighten slightly, not in fear, but in awareness. I started then stopped. My voice felt uncertain now, like the words were harder to organize than before. She didn't interrupt. She waited. That patience, that quiet willingness to let me struggle without pushing, made it worse in a strange way. Because it meant she wasn't forcing anything out of me. She was letting it come naturally, or not at all. I finally spoke again, quieter. I didn't expect to feel like this. The moment I said it, the room changed. Not physically, but emotionally. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but something in her gaze softened further. Like those words confirmed something she had already sensed but never claimed. For a moment, she looked away, just briefly, as if collecting herself. Then she returned her eyes to me, calmer again, but different now. "I thought so," she said softly. Not surprised, not pleased, just understanding. And in that simple response, something unspoken finally stopped hiding between us. Not resolved, but revealed. After that admission, the room didn't return to normal. It couldn't. Something had already shifted too far for things to simply go back to how they were before. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of everything we had both said without fully saying it, and everything we hadn't dared to name out loud. She stayed seated for a moment longer, her posture still composed, but her expression quieter now. The confidence was still there, but softened at the edges, like a curtain pulled just slightly aside. I noticed she didn't rush to stand up. That felt important, even if I didn't fully understand why. Eventually, she picked up her cup again, though she didn't drink from it. She simply held it for a moment, eyes lowered, as if gathering her thoughts behind that calm exterior she always maintained. Then she spoke, not abruptly, not emotionally, but carefully measured. "You should be careful with what you feel," she said. A pause, "and what you think you feel." Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warning me in a harsh way. It was softer than that, almost protective, but layered with restraint, like she was standing at a line she was very aware of and making sure I could see it too. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was I wasn't sure what answer was safe anymore. She finally set her cup down again, this time a little farther away on the table. The sound was light, but it felt louder in the silence that followed. Then she leaned back slightly into the couch, crossing her hands gently in her lap. For the first time tonight, there was a small distance between us again, not emotional distance, but physical awareness. A boundary reappearing in real time. But even that didn't feel like separation anymore. It felt like recognition. She looked at me again, longer this time, her gaze steady but no longer probing. "I'm not trying to confuse you," she added quietly. A pause. "I just don't want you to misunderstand yourself." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else she had said before, because it didn't deny what was happening. It simply refused to let it become careless. I shifted slightly, suddenly more aware of where I was sitting, of how close the space still felt even with nothing physically changing. My hands tightened together for a moment, then relaxed again. "I'm not misunderstanding it," I said quietly, almost without thinking. The words came out before I could fully weigh them. Her eyes moved slightly at that, a subtle reaction, not shock, not surprise, but acknowledgement. And for a second, I thought she might say something immediately. But she didn't. Instead, she just studied me again, not like before, not like she was trying to decode me. This time it felt different, more personal, more conflicted, like she was seeing something she couldn't fully step away from anymore. Then softly, she stood, not in a sudden way, not like she was leaving in discomfort, more like she was choosing to regain control of the moment before it deepened further. "I think it's getting late," she said gently. Normal words, safe words, but they didn't erase what had just passed between us. As she turned slightly toward the hallway, she paused for a brief second, just enough for me to notice. Not a goodbye, not distance, just restraint. And in that small pause, I understood something without it being spoken. Whatever was forming between us had already crossed the point of simple curiosity. Now it was about limits, and whether either of us was ready to respect them or quietly test them again. The house felt different after she left the room. Not emptier, but quieter in a more deliberate way. Like the air itself had settled down after holding something in for too long. The faint sound of footsteps fading into the hallway was the last clear trace of movement, and then even that disappeared. I stayed seated for a while, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because leaving felt like breaking something fragile that hadn't fully finished forming yet. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was reflective, like it was giving me space to understand what had just happened, instead of pushing me away from it. The warmth of the room still remained, but it didn't feel the same now. It felt calmer, more grounded, as if everything that had been emotionally charged earlier had slowly softened into something quieter and more stable. I remember glancing at the empty space across from me, where she had been sitting. The impression of her presence lingered more than the actual moment. The way she spoke, the pauses she allowed, the careful distance she maintained even when everything else between us had shifted. Nothing about her felt careless. Even now, thinking back, I could feel how controlled every step of the conversation had been, not to suppress emotion, but to contain it. That realization didn't create confusion anymore. It created clarity, because I understood something I hadn't before. She wasn't pulling me towards something without awareness. She was fully aware of every step, every pause, every boundary she placed, and every moment she allowed to exist between us. And that made everything feel more real, not less. I leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, letting my thoughts settle instead of chasing them. For the first time, I wasn't trying to decode her anymore. I was just accepting what had already been shown. A few minutes later, I heard her again, soft footsteps in another part of the house, distant and calm. Life continuing as it always had. That normality should have felt strange after everything, but it didn't. It actually helped. It reminded me that nothing had been broken, just understood differently. When she eventually returned briefly to the edge of the room, not fully entering this time, just appearing at the doorway, her presence felt composed again. The earlier emotional weight wasn't gone, but it was no longer in control of the space. She looked at me once, just once, not searching, not testing, not questioning, simply acknowledging. There was a small pause where neither of us spoke. And in that pause, everything unnecessary seemed to fall away. No pressure, no expectation, just awareness of what had passed between us and what it meant without needing to define it further. Then she gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, subtle enough that it could have been missed if I wasn't paying attention. Not approval, not distance, just understanding. "I'll be in the kitchen," she said gently, her tone returning to something calm and ordinary again. And that was it. No weight behind the words. No hidden tension. Just the simplicity of returning to normal actions after something deeply human had been acknowledged. As she turned away, I realized something quietly important. Nothing between us had been resolved in a dramatic way. There were no declarations, no conclusions, no defined ending. But there was acceptance, mutual unspoken acceptance, that something had been felt, recognized, and understood, and that it didn't need to become anything more to still be real. And strangely enough, that was enough. Because for the first time, the silence didn't feel like uncertainty anymore. It felt like peace.